Paris, March 1963. The conference room on the third floor of the Hotel Lutetia had been arranged since 7 in the morning. 12 chairs lined one side of a long table. A podium had been placed at the head of the room facing the press seats, and on the podium a single sheet of paper sat in a manila folder that had been closed but not sealed. Outside, on the Boulevard Raspail, 3 news vehicles were already parked along the curb. Photographers moved along the pavement, adjusting lenses, checking light. A light drizzle had started at 8:30, and nobody had left. They had been told she would arrive at 10. It was 9:52. Inside, a publicist named Renee moved between the water glasses and the arranged microphones with the focused efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment for 72 hours. The letter in the folder on the podium had been written, reviewed, and approved by 4 people. It was 1 page. It was concise. It was everything the studio needed her to say in public, and it had taken 3 weeks to produce. What happens when an institution decides it can script someone else's contrition? What does it look like when a woman walks into a room already built around her surrender? And what do you do when the words on the page belong to everyone except the person being asked to speak them? If this is your first time here, subscribe now and turn on the bell notification. This channel covers the defining moments of cinema, culture, and the women who refuse to disappear quietly. You will not want to miss what comes next. This script is a historically inspired fictional reconstruction. The scenes, dialogue, and characters depicted are dramatized interpretations and are not presented as documented or verified fact. All secondary characters are fictional. This content was produced with AI assistance and is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. In the winter of 1963, Brigitte Bardot was one of the most photographed women alive and one of the least consulted. Decisions about her public image had been moving through a structure of managers, studio heads, and legal representatives for years, and she had learned to read the shape of those decisions before they arrived on paper. This one had arrived on paper 3 weeks earlier in the form of a handwritten note from a senior figure at the production company, delivered to her apartment by courier at 6 in the evening. She had read the note at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold beside her. The note described a situation, a film marketing disagreement that had become public in the press, and outlined a preferred resolution. The resolution required her to issue a public statement acknowledging that a comment she had made in a prior interview had caused professional disruption. The word it used for what she needed to do was clarify. She had set the note on the table and looked at it for a long time. Her representative, a man named Alain who operated from an office in the 8th arrondissement, had called that same evening. The conversation had been brief and factual. Alain had explained the position of the production company, the position of the distributor, and the position of the press office in that order. She had listened without interrupting. When he had finished, she asked him one question: whether any of the parties had considered issuing a clarification of their own. There had been a pause on the line. He had said he would follow up. He had followed up 4 days later with a meeting in his office. The meeting had included a lawyer named Bertrand and a representative from the studio's communications department, whose name she was given but did not retain. The table was rectangular. The 3 men sat on one side, she sat on the other. Bertrand had a document in front of him. He turned it to face her and slid it across the table. It was a draft statement. It was typed. Her name appeared in the first sentence. She had read it in full without touching it. Then she had looked at Bertrand and asked which part of the original interview statement was factually incorrect. Bertrand had straightened slightly in his chair. He said the accuracy of the statement was not the primary concern. The concern was its impact on the project and on the relationships attached to it. She had nodded once and looked back at the document. She had not picked it up. The meeting had ended without an agreement. Alain had called twice more in the following week. She had taken both calls. The letter had been revised. The language had been adjusted. By the third draft it was shorter, softer, and phrased in a way that could be read as neither admission nor denial, a piece of language engineered to satisfy every party except the one delivering it. She had read the third draft at her desk, and then she had folded it once horizontally along its midpoint and placed it in the drawer beside her correspondence. 3 weeks after the initial note, the press conference had been scheduled. The format was formal. A prepared statement read aloud to journalists, questions accepted for 15 minutes, photographs permitted at the close. Renee had organized it. Elaine had approved the room. Bertrand had confirmed the final draft of the letter and had it printed on clean white paper that morning at 8 o'clock. He had placed it in the manila folder himself and walked it to the podium before the press entered. The journalists arrived at 9:45, 14 of them from 7 publications, 3 with cameras, 1 with a portable recording device that he placed on the table in front of the press seats without asking anyone's permission. The room had a low ceiling and 3 overhead fluorescent panels. The windows faced east. By 10 in the morning, the light through the drizzle was gray and flat and even. Bertrand stood to the left of the podium. René stood near the door. Elaine sat in a chair along the right wall with his hands on his knees. The room held the particular density of a space where everyone present knows something important is about to be performed, and nobody is entirely comfortable with the word performed. She arrived at 10 past 10. She entered through the main door in a dark coat, hair loose. She moved toward the podium without looking at the press seats. She reached the podium. She looked at the manila folder. She placed her left hand on it and stood still for a moment. Renee, near the door, had her hands clasped. Elaine had straightened in his chair. She opened the folder. The single sheet of paper was inside. She lifted it with both hands. She read the first line. The room held its collective breath in the manner of people who believe they know what comes next. The room went quiet, not gradually, but completely, as though the drizzle outside had stopped too. The journalists who had been shifting in their seats stilled. The photographer who had been adjusting a lens cap placed it on the table without a sound. Bertrand, standing to the left, did not move. His eyes stayed on her face. She stood at the podium with the letter in both hands and read the second line. She read the third. Her expression had not changed. Her posture was straight. The overhead light gave her face a clean, factual clarity that made every small movement visible. The journalist with the recording device leaned forward 2 centimeters. All eyes turned to her hands. Renee, at the door, had pressed herself back against the wall without realizing it. Alain, on his chair, had one hand on his knee and one gripping the chair's arm. The 3 photographers had their cameras up but were not shooting. Something in the room's pressure was telling them to wait. Nobody could have explained exactly what they were waiting for. She reached the bottom of the page. She lowered it slightly. The room's silence had now lasted long enough to become its own presence. Bertrand shifted his weight from his right foot to his left. His jaw was set. He had managed press situations for 11 years, and he recognized the shape of what was happening without being able to name it yet. Her next breath was slow and visible. The paper was still in both hands. She looked at the press seats, not at any specific journalist, but at the room as a whole, a single steady survey that lasted less than 3 seconds and covered every face in front of her. Then she looked back down at the page. Her thumbs moved to the center crease of the paper. She folded the letter. One clean horizontal fold along its midpoint, precisely. The sound it made in the silence was paper against paper, dry, brief, final. Her hands held the folded page for exactly a moment. She looked up. No one moved. The photographer closest to her had his finger on the shutter and did not press it. She set the folded letter on top of the closed manila folder. She straightened her coat with one small adjustment at the lapel. She looked at the podium for one last second as though confirming something to herself. Then she turned from the podium and walked toward the door at the same pace she had entered, even unhurried, belonging entirely to itself. Renee stepped aside from the door without speaking. The door opened. She passed through it. The door closed behind her with a soft click that carried in the silence like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The room did not move for 4 full seconds. Then the photographer, with his finger still on the shutter, pressed it, capturing not Bardot but the empty podium, the manila folder, the folded letter sitting on top of it in the gray morning light. Bertrand crossed the room in 6 steps. He picked up the letter. He opened it. He read it as though something might have changed. Hélène had stood from his chair. He looked at Renee. Renee looked at the door. The journalist with the recording device reached forward and turned it off. The 14 journalists sat in their press chairs in a room that now had a podium but no speaker, a statement but no voice, and a story none of them had been assigned to cover because no one had anticipated it. By midday, the press conference had not been described by any publication as a press conference. It had been described as a statement, though no statement had been delivered in the conventional sense. What had been delivered was a gesture, and the gesture had been witnessed by 14 journalists, 3 photographers, and 1 recording device that had captured exactly 6 seconds of ambient room sound before being switched off. That was enough. By the following morning, the story had moved in the direction of the gesture rather than the letter. The folded page on the podium had been photographed. That photograph had been published. The image of the letter, folded and set down and walked away from, communicated more about the situation than any of the approved language inside it ever could have. The studio issued a brief statement of its own that afternoon. Bertrand had written it. It was 4 sentences. What happened in that conference room on the Boulevard Raspail was not a refusal dressed in drama. It was a refusal stripped of drama entirely, performed in silence, at regular pace with both hands. She had read the letter. She had understood exactly what it asked of her. And she had answered the only question that actually mattered, not whether she would read the words, but whether she would deliver them. The letter had been written by a room full of people who believed that a woman in a difficult position would take the path they had prepared. They had prepared the podium. They had prepared the folder. They had prepared the press. What they had not prepared for was the possibility that she would arrive, read every word they had written, and then communicate her answer through the motion of her hands rather than the movement of her mouth. The lesson from that morning is not complicated, but it is precise. A public statement does not require words. A refusal, delivered in full view of the people who expected compliance, becomes its own record. What she said on that podium was not a blank page. It was a response, folded, dated, and left for the room to interpret without her assistance. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that silence, delivered at the right moment and in the right room, is one of the most articulate things a person can do. Remember what Brigitte Bardot taught us about the difference between presence and compliance, and why the most powerful statement she ever made in front of a room full of press was the one she never spoke aloud.